No,
Well, it was around about that time, correct me if I'm wrong, but you moved to bigger premises in the Surrey Research Park.
no, that was we still had Powermonger to do, and
Oh, did you?
we started Populous 2 in in the original office,
Yeah.
and then we moved to the research park halfway through Populous 2. So it would have been maybe it probably was only about a year and a half later. Yeah.
Okay. So Powermongers, that's pretty similar to Populous in many ways, wasn't it? How did you get to, how difficult was it to change it into the 3D vector?
Well, for me, it was basically the thing that I wanted to work on next because I was fascinated by the 3D games. It's kind of weird because it's sort of even if you look at the best Atari ST and Amiga demos, these days 3D the poly counts were so low. I mean, like
Mm,
if you went over a few hundred polys, you were looking at a really bad frame rate,
mm,
and Powermonger was it, it it sort of ran at an okay frame rate. I was quite pleased with the speed of the polygon routine in that, but it was just overused. And then there was so much other processing going on that most 3D games didn't have. Like
yeah.
the at one point, the re-ranking of like a big army would cause a half-second pause. And that's because the whole thing was written in pure assembler. Populous was half C, but we moved to pure assembler because we believed it was faster, and it just isn't worth the hassle. You know, it because you can't write everything optimized, and the stuff that's not painstakingly optimized is so much harder to read that you're probably going to miss out on a better algorithm by the fact that you're stuck in assembler. And
Yeah.
that was I think that was true even on ST and Amiga. It was maybe I'm overstating it. It was definitely not worth writing stuff in pure assembler on the
Mm.
PC later. But Powermonger, I mean, I didn't like Powermonger because landscape modification had gone from the game, and it and in some ways it was great because it was sort of a proto RTS. It was it was this group send them over here. Real time strategy games just weren't a thing at that point,
Yeah.
and it could have you could sort of, but it wasn't quite slick enough to be able to take credit for it being an RTS because there was too much
Mm.
focus on the weird rotations and stuff. But the things that I loved about it was like the the way that the snow fell, for example. That was all algorithmic. And I was basically playing around with the way the random number generators worked and figured out that you could make a random number generator generate every dot on a 16 by 16 dither pattern in a random appearing order. So if you look at Powermonger, if you can see it in the videos now, you can see snow falling and it actually settles on the ground and then fades away again, and it's just changing the dither patterns. And people think that dither patterns are textures, which is stupid because that would be impossible on an Amiga, on an ST or an Amiga. They're just literally overblown dither patterns with lots of colors in that are 16 by 16 instead of the normal 2 by 2 or maybe 4 by 4 pixels. So I was kind of pleased with some of that stuff, but it didn't really. It was really too early to be working on 3D,
Yeah.
and it's one of those. I mean, with hindsight, I would kind of. I wish I'd have. I wish I hadn't been. I would like to have not bothered with that and then moved to doing 3D on PC slightly earlier,
Yeah.
because that's where it started to make proper sense.
Was it quite difficult to mix the sprites on top of the vectors?
We just didn't care about the scaling. If you look at Powermonger, it looks ridiculous because the sprites stay the same size whether you're looking at a 2 by 2 grid of cells or a 16 by 16. Because you can zoom
Yeah.
right to 2 by 2 and it runs along at about 20 frames a second. And there's like this little tiny people in the middle of these great big squares. Or you can zoom out to like see a 16 by 16 area where and at that point it'll be drawing 512 triangles and running at about 1 frame every 2 seconds, and all the people are exactly the same size. It just the fact that none of the reviews sort of stated this and pointed out how ridiculous it was. It's just one of those. one of those weird things about game development. It's a bit like another game we did at the same time as Powermonger, funnily enough, was Flood. Do you remember that?
I do, yeah.
The Amiga version was like sort of smooth scrolling in 8 directions, and the ST version, because it couldn't scroll, it would burst scroll. Like you get to the edge of the screen, and it would just go chunk. It would scroll at 16 pixels a time until your character moved over, to the center, and it would do it again. And there wasn't a single review that said, "Oh, the ST version's got shite scrolling compared to the Amiga." I just don't know how you get away with it. I designed something like 6 levels for Flood, as well as doing the ST port, and 5 of my 6 levels were 1 screen wide, and I did it because I just thought I want those 5 levels to look as good on the ST as they do on the Amiga. I'm going to cheat, but I'm making it vertical only scrolling. But yeah, it's funny. It's funny, but like you say, the scale. How did we handle the sprites mixed in with the polygons on Powermonger? We just crossed our fingers and hoped no one would notice, and they didn't. Yeah, it's weird. It's weird the things that reviewers notice. But it's like, sorry to go back to Populous. People would say, and we had reviews on Populous saying, "Oh, this is lovely. It's obviously a 32 color game that nobody could, that you couldn't do on an ST or something." And like the ST version was identical. In fact, the palette on Populous was stolen from Dungeon Master on the ST.
Right.
I played that game and I was so impressed with how they'd managed to reserve 5 shades of grey and still get such a useful set of colors that work with each other. Like the yellow would double as the brightest brown and the brightest green, and be the yellow to go with the orange was the bright brown, and also the orange that went with the red for fire, and you thought you end up with this sort of effective 28 color palette or something. And yeah, it's just the reviews in those days were weird. People were very receptive to what we were doing, and it was great.
Let's talk us through Populous 2 then. So what major changes did you make to the actual engine on that?
Well, Populous 2 was the only time I ever worked on Amiga Blitter code.
Right.
Populous used the CPU to render the screen. I think the only thing the Blitter did on the Amiga version of Populous was clear the screen. And similarly on Powermonger, in fact, I wrote all the screen handling routines on Powermonger by writing an Amiga screen format emulator for the ST.
Yeah.
So that I could actually write all the polygon renderers on there without having to move over to the ST, because I had like a nice fast hard disk on my ST at the time.
Yeah.
But Populous 2 marked the time when I moved to the Amiga proper, and I had a more powerful Amiga than the ST, and it was the only time. Yeah, we touched on the Blitter, and so it was using semi-efficient blitz to draw all the aligned blocks, so we could do the full screen this time, and it was way more efficient on that, but it still wasn't very efficient. I mean, the stuff which I've learned since about we were doing like 4 blitz, 1 for each bit plane, but if you're clever about how you organize the memory, you can set up some modulus value and do them all at once and all this. And I didn't know about that crap, because that was my actually getting my hands dirty and writing to the Blitter was just the screen handling routines in Populous 2.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, Populous 2 was an interesting one because Populous had been me and Peter, with me doing all the graphics, all the engine work, and the ST port. And Populous 2 was there were 2 dedicated artists and another designer, and I was just the ST port guy, and I was sort of I was messing about with other stuff at the same time, to be honest, as well. I think I might have even had a PC on my desk by the time I definitely had a PC on my desk by the time it finished. So although I do actually, I think I always used to say that I like Populous 1 better than Populous 2, but I played it recently. I played it at the Zap event last year, and it was and it's so slow on an Amiga that it's just unbelievable. And Populous 2 isn't. So Populous 2 is a better game, and it looks better because it's got, you know, two professional artists working on it for a year with like these incredible sprite sheets and complicated fire thing. It's definitely definitely a better game. It was arrogant of me to try and pretend otherwise. I was sort of, yeah, it's the only, but it was, I was kind of slightly less into it than the and definitely less intimately involved with it than the original. Oh, the other thing I didn't like, the thing I didn't like about it as well is that I didn't know what to do because there was 36 different spells that you could you could possibly use, and it was just like you know, if you were trying to play it multiplayer, you could end up winning by just using something that you did, by the other player using something that you didn't really know how to use, and that sort of seemed to go a little bit against the ethos of Populous, which is like you've got this simple palette of stuff and you've just got to use it. But
Yeah.
but it's the kind of stuff that people wanted back then, like back then, and they like even more now. There's the complexity and layers and being able to build things up and stuff. So yeah, it was a cool game, and it was yeah, and it was definitely a very worthy sequel. There was the data disc for it was really good as well. There was a thing called I can't remember what it was called now, but it was much more scripted levels. So instead of like
Mm.
being you had to sort of you sort of had a task like get these guys over to here or whatever, and that I think it was called the challenge games or something. But that barely, and like the data disc for the original Populous had taken a week for us to knock up some new graphics for, and 2 hours for Peter to knock up a new level description file for, and then we just shipped it out. Whereas the challenge games for Populous 2 took Peter and Alex Trowers, who's the best designer that Bullfrog had, other than Peter maybe. He was. It took the two of them like 3 or 4 months, to get the data disc out, and the reaction was much less than the reaction had been for just a bunch of new graphics for the original game. You can't. I suppose by then the Amiga was getting a little bit long in the tooth. Not really. We jumped ship on the Amiga quite early though, really, I think.
Mm.
Because I remember there were still Amiga games coming out up until like 95 or so, weren't there?
Yeah.
There were 1200 for
Mm.
but yeah, no, sorry, I can't remember what the question was.
Well,
So,
going to Magic Carpet, I mean, that was a massive change, wasn't it? In terms of
well, yeah,
gameplay.
I was, I retrospectively, I was already working on Magic Carpet was what I was working on the PC while Populous 2 was being finished, because, and that was a that was a love. Basically, what I was saying earlier on about the polygon rendering being something that wasn't really suited to the ST and Amiga.
Mm.
By the time I was working on the PC, you could rely on the 256 color MCGA mode, or which is it's often called VGA because nearly every VGA card handles it, but technically VGA is just a 16 color mode with 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 more with a bigger adjustable palette,
Mm.
but the MCGA mode, to byte per pixel, you got a 320 by 200 screen, 64,000 bytes, and you just stick a byte into a location in memory, and that's a pixel. And that is so lovely if you're trying to write 3D polygon routines.
Yeah.
So, the first PCs that I worked on would have been like 33 meg 486s.
Yeah.
So my first sort of PC polygon renderer was maybe 20 times faster than the ST and Amiga had been.
Right.
You
Okay.
don't have to mess about with all this masking and stuff, to into bit planes and stuff. You have to just work out a quick way of working out where the edges are, and then you can just splat the pixels in. And and that was a really, really exciting time to be working in real-time graphics, because it was before the internet and stuff. So I don't know where I got the references from, but for some, maybe it was just, I remember I got wind of the idea of Gurad shading, or
Mm.
I can't, I still don't know. I should know how to pronounce that, but it's, I think I did once, but I've forgotten again. Uh, but Guru shading or whatever is where every vertex of a triangle has a different color, has a different shade, and you know, or a different color. But yeah, that just means you're doing the shading in R, G, and B. But we were doing it like in monochrome, sort of light to dark. So you'd have you could, but it actually works out that there's a difference in color between any two given pixels,
Mm.
and that's constant over the shape, over the triangle. So once you work out what those differences are, and this is weird because I had to, also I was also the other thing for Powermonger, I'd had to work out how to do 3D maths. So all that vector maths that I didn't get my head around at school, I had to sort of figure out when I was about 26, 27, from first principles. But but the but the what was I saying? Yeah, so I managed to get Guru shading working. So I had this sort of landscape thing. It was very similar to the Powermonger one, really, except you were flying around it in first person, like some kind of flight sim. And there were all these 256 different colored things, colored polygons. And then after a while, I got this idea of getting the Guru shading. So each corner was each vertex had a different shade, and you got a smooth shade across it. Those of games had that. Um, uh, and uh, and I remember we were so I had this landscape where you were flying around like that, and then at one point I set the palette up to be just all shades of blue, just
Mhm.
because I just wanted to see the shading really smoothing stuff out, so rather than having these sort of ranges of color that you could shade into, it was like shading into this big block of, I think, 64 blues, and and I remember Peter wandered past and said, "Oh, that game should be underwater because it looks like it's underwater." And then the game became the first iteration of creation, which was the underwater submarine game. But I never got as far as working on the game. I was just working on the tech for it, and then at some point we saw we had some. I remember seeing screenshots of Ultima Underworld,
Mm.
marveling at the texture mapping on it. This would have been about the same time that Wolfenstein came out, but for some reason I could see Wolfenstein was a trick that only worked with vertical walls and wasn't quite so impressed with it. And even though it looked much nicer, but it was so much faster. Um, it was Ultima Underworld that was making me think, how the hell do you do texture mapping? And then something clicked, and I realized that texture mapping is kind of just 2D Gurad shading.
Yeah.
If you take the value that you're going to use as the shade and say that's the X Y coordinate in the text, the X coordinate in the texture, then do it again for the Y coordinate, and then rename X and Y U and V, because that's this you end up with a primitive texture mapper, a PlayStation 1 style affine texture mapper. So I quickly knocked that up, and then the underwater game went back out of the water as we start, and I got an artist assigned to it, and we had this just nice landscape which you could fly around with with um with grass and rocks and snow and stuff, and that slowly became Magic Carpet. It was
Mm.
because it was, and I was working on that for quite a long time. All the time that Syndicate and Theme Park were in development, I was messing about with that technology.
Mm.
And after Sean Cooper had finished Syndicate, he was basically we basically decided the Magic Carpet had to come out soon. I think Les and Peter came back from an early E3 or something that existed before E3. I can't remember. And Doom had taken had been such a huge thing that they were sort of like, we need to get like an action game out, and we're gonna take that Magic Carpet thing that Glenn's working on and get it finished. And Sean was drafted in, having just finished Syndicate, and he finished turning it into a game. He just basically took the engine that was from where it was, which was like this landscape thing, and with scaling sprite bad guys and stuff, and just just turned it into a game. It was yeah, and he did it quite quickly. I think he was probably only working on it for less than a year to get it out, and I'd been working on the tech behind it for like at least a couple of years at that point.
Yeah.
It was but yeah, it was a pretty cool game. It's one of the games I'd love to work on again. That do some kind of spiritual successor to, because it was the last game we did as well, which had a modifiable landscape. You know, in some
Yes.
way, it was almost like, you know, the populous landscape, but done in 3D. Like I do like Power Monger to do it, but you know,
Yeah.
but it needed the power of a PC to do that.
Yeah. Did you do any work at all on the Syndicate Wars games?
Well, I did a little bit of work on Syndicate. I helped design the system for it.
Yeah.
Because I you know, I hate to keep going backwards in time, but you know, as I was sort of saying about how Populus's isometric was very brute force and simplistic, whereas on the Spectrum and on the 8 bits they'd had to do spin dizzy, they'd have had to have done partial updates and stuff.
Yeah.
I'd written a demo on the ST of how I imagined that partial update stuff would work. It was a vertical scrolling isometric just demo of like this world where you could move this ball around or something. And Sean took that, rewrote it much better in for the PC, and then that became Syndicate. But apart from that sort of a little bit of design work with Sean at the beginning,
Yeah.
I my input to that was I made 6 of the levels, and then with Syndicate Wars later on, Syndicate Wars used my tech from Magic Carpet, you know, because there was a period sort of around the time that Bullfrog was being signed to EA where we had like 4 different games, I think 5 maybe, that used the Magic Carpet renderer. Because Gene Wars used that amazingly. Even though Gene Wars is a sort of isometric game, it still used the Magic Carpet polygon renderer to render because it could, because there was no reason not to, because it was done with partial updates and didn't need to be sort of blinding, you know, didn't need to be blindingly fast. And Syndicate Wars used that, and then Creation, which was the canned submarine game, used it, and Dungeon Keeper used it. So it was everything in development at that point, except for Theme Hospital, was using that Magic Carpet tech at one point.
Right.
So this would have been in like about 95, about the time that Bullfrog was sold to EA.
Speaking of which, so when they bought out Bullfrog and Peter sort of moved upstairs, wasn't he, a little bit? So did that alter the culture of the company at all?
Well, Bullfrog expanded very slowly. I mean, we were dealing with EA from the second game, from Fusion onwards, and what was happening, I think, was basically because we kept having these hits and making a decent amount of money, the amount of money we were requiring up front was getting less and less. And it got to the point when we were sort of negotiating for Magic Carpet and maybe some of the others, that we were asking for 0 up fronts, and the amount of royalty per copy was entering unheard of territory. And that was the point when EA decided they were going to buy us instead. And yeah, I think that's basically how it went, you know. But and initially there wasn't that much of a culture change, but what kind of happened with EA, you know, there was nobody. They didn't put anybody in, or they didn't bring anybody over to yeah to. There was nobody put into the company from EA at that point. And this would have been like 95. But what did happen was that Peter found himself in the States on, you know, as part of EA's worldwide steering committee, and that's how something like High Octane happened in 7 weeks flat. I don't know if you know about that drive. That was basically that was Sean was the main person involved with that, but it was basically using an early version of the Dungeon Keeper engine that still had a sort of undulating Magic Carpet type landscape underneath it. That was removed for Dungeon Keeper itself, but it was left in for High Octane. and it was knocked up in 7 weeks flat. Because Peter was in a meeting in Canada where somebody they were saying about there was a big hole in the release schedule for that autumn, and everybody around the table was being asked if that studio could possibly bring any of their games forward. And we couldn't bring Magic Carpet forward or Theme Hospital, whatever else was in development. But Peter sort of said, maybe we can do a whole new game. And we got this weird conference call where me and Sean were involved, and probably a few other people. Like, can we do this thing? What would we do if we were going to do a game? And we ended up doing High Octane, which was so you asked the question about EA culture. It is kind of relating that happened. But the interesting thing about that was everybody loved playing High Octane, but there was a point where it's basically like the ship, your car, it handles like an asteroid ship basically. You spin it around and it's got like a thrust thing where you build up a boost, and then you can hit the boost button and spend some of it to get an extra boost out of it. And it was a great little racing game. People used to play a network LAN game every lunchtime, and people were really into it. And then it kind of got ruined because it was decided that it needed to be less skill based and more about picking up power ups and shooting the other players and stuff. And suddenly, the actual competitiveness of the racing disappeared. I tried to recreate it myself actually for my first mobile game, which is a thing called High Octane. Not High Octane. That was High Octane. It was a thing called Ground Effect, which I did for the iPhone in 2009, and it was It played a little bit like High Octane had, but it still wasn't the same. I couldn't quite nail. I don't know. It's probably because just the vagaries of the control system, of the physics, because it wasn't proper physics or anything. It was just whatever Sean knocked up, and I couldn't recreate it properly. But it was quite a nice little game on the phone when it did come out. Anyway, that's really good, really gone off on one. But yeah, the culture didn't really change much, but Peter was missing, and also during this time, Dungeon Keeper was in development, and that was what I was working on most of the time, was the engine for Dungeon Keeper, which sort of I was very, very happy with. I was working with Mark Healy on that, who was the guy who did who was doing all the graphics for it, and he was like doing something unheard of at the time, in that he wasn't drawing the textures in D-Paint and to stick on the walls. He was modeling them in 3ds and the old 3D Studio, the old DOS version of 3D Studio, and rendering them out, and then taking that as so basically it meant that people were looking at the Dungeon Keeper graphics and going, "Those bump mapped," no, they're not. They were just rendered, and you just haven't seen that before, and yeah, we had we had the engine for Dungeon Keeper working, but when Peter got back, he decided he didn't like the game, and he sort of shelved the version that was in development and started again from scratch. But at that point, the culture hadn't really changed, and he was like, I've let things slide. I've let the game go in a wrong direction. But I'm not 100% sure that's true. I think it possibly could have been salvaged, but it wasn't the vision that he had. And Dungeon Keeper was an idea that he really wanted to do this reverse dungeon game, and there were two different false starts of it, both of which could have been really nice games in their own right, but they weren't the game that Peter wanted to do. So he came back and he was like, no, I should be here working on this game. Because that was the other thing about Peter as well, is that there's certain games like Syndicate and Magic Carpet, he wasn't that involved with them. I mean, he was paying attention to them and talking to the developers, but while those things were being done, he was working on Theme Park and then Dungeon Keeper. So he didn't touch Syndicate or Magic Carpet much. So the whole way he worked really was to be really mucking in on one of the games at a given time, and being and sort of a secondary role of overseeing the studio. And so that all, yeah. So he went back to being that for a little while, and then of course there's the whole thing which is quite well documented. Every time he talks about this, I've heard him talking about this very recently. But he decided he wanted to leave, and he had to finish Dungeon Keeper, and he did it in his house. And like the way he tells it, it was because he didn't want him in the studio messing things up, which may well be true. But that was the point when the culture really started changing, because as soon as Peter wasn't there, they started bringing in people from outside, and I think with hindsight, they did a pretty good job of keeping the culture together, and nothing was really that drastic, but it did put a lot of people's noses out of joint. And like it wasn't, I think because what kind of happened was everybody started to leave. So all the other senior people ended up leaving for Lionhead, and Peter left, or leaving for Big Blue Box, which they wrapped into Lionhead, or for Mucky Foot, and a lot of those guys ended up about Lionhead as well. Then me and a bunch of other guys left for Lost Toys. So but that wasn't really because EA had changed culture. It was more because people could see the writing on the wall and wanted, So so does that mean letting EA off the hook? I don't know, but a lot of people were just including me, saw that as a cue to leave. I mean, I left because I was working on a project called Indestructibles. It was a sort of superhero simulator thing, and it was kind of cool. It was a bit like, I mean, my vision for it was that it was going to be, not that it was my vision, but I was kind of technical project lead on it, sort of thing. Not the main designer or anything, but we were playing a lot of Quake in the office at that time. The whole point was going to be that you were patrolling as a superhero,
right?
And so you'd have this city that you'd know your way around, rather like the way that you know your way around a multiplayer level of Quake when you play it all the time. So, and you'd have that, you'd have your super sense would say there's a crime going on over here, and you'd see some kind of pillar of light in the sky that would tell you to go over there or whatever. And then it would all be about how quickly you could get around the level, and so try and get some of the feel of multiplayer Quake type games into it. And we had it working multiplayer as well. Like you could fly. We would. I remember in the engine we had one point we went downstairs to the team that were making a football management game, and we got a copy of their football pitch, and then we got a Volkswagen camper model from some library. I can't remember, some 3D library that was big at the time, and we had fun.
Viewpoint.
Yes, yeah, we got the Viewpoint Volkswagen camper model, and we would play this game we used called Camper Ball, which is basically where 8 players would run around the pitch, firing fireballs and trying to get this camper into the other team's goal. And this is the most brilliant bit of emergent gameplay, the most stupid bit of emergent gameplay. There's no scoring, no nothing, and all that was just down to the teams to sort of keep track of what the score was. And what would happen is sometimes the camper would fall off the side of the pitch, and the only way to get it back would be for everyone to go downstairs and all get underneath it and lift it. It was really, but we were working on this thing, and it was kind of working. It was working in multiplayer, and it was working fast, and it was working pretty efficiently, all native direct 3D stuff. And Peter was gone by then, so there was no one obvious to impress with this thing. And then we got different messages from various senior people at EA. One of them was like, "This is great. This could be our entry into the the Quake and probably Unreal market." It was probably a thing by then as well. And then somebody else from EA said, "What if there's a superhero game? Why aren't you talking to Marvel? I mean, how stupid is that?" So we sort of dutifully spoke to Marvel. The guy who was the producer on it, the internal producer on it, spoke to Marvel, and we basically got a message back from them saying, "Here's our list of 2,000 superheroes that we own. If any of yours are like these, we're going to have a problem with it." And
Oh
like
shit.
and like that kind of didn't help, because it meant that
Yeah.
one of our two excited Americans was now scared, and they shelved the project. They literally canned it and told it was like, I think there was like, it was only like 8 of us working on it at the time, and they told 3 of us that we were still working on it, that we were just treading water and experimenting while they worked out what they were going to do with the tech. And I was so offended by the way that they'd actually they everybody else on the team, there was the other 5 people, I think 2 or 3 of them were sacked and the others were moved. And I was so offended by the fact that the guys that got sacked, they didn't even speak to me or the lead programmer, or or anyone else senior on or the producer, about whether or not this should happen. It just happened. We were just told this has happened. This project is now on hold and it's underneath this guy who came in from outside. And and I left in a fit of pique, really, because like, but by then, half the people that I had any respect for or had left for Lionhead or Muckyfoot or whatever anyway. So the whole thing, yeah, it was sort of, it was a shame, really. It was probably an overreaction, but and they were offering me all kinds of cool stuff to work on as I left. But at the time, I was feeling very indignant. But
Oh, it happens, mate. It happens.